Well, it is kind of interesting that we're talking to Senator Margaret O'Brien from Kalamazoo today about what happened almost a year ago now along I-94, a massive crash that many of us will remember well. And it was Senator O'Brien who said, somebody ought to study this stretch of roadway and figure out what the heck's going on there. And turns out that that did result. And, in fact, there was a study of more than just that stretch of roadway, and she's on the line to talk with us a little bit about that this morning. Senator, good morning to you.
Good morning, Richard. It's great to talk to you again.
Well, thank you. It's great to have you here. We appreciate the time you're giving us today. So this crash happened in January last year, and you were inspired to say, somebody ought to check this out.
Yes, it's very cliche and easy to say, well, people don't know how to drive. That's why it happens. But, right. For those of us who travel eastern Kalamazoo County, western Calhoun County, we know there's something different about that border that we all share. And we've been stuck in the accidents. We see them, and it seems like they happen there more than any place else. And so when the comments were made that, people just don't know how to drive, you don't have a 193-car accident just because people don't know how to drive. So I did call on the governor. I asked for a study to be done. And the governor not only said yes, but he expanded the study to have I-94 from the Indiana border all the way to Jackson.
Mm-hmm. It is interesting because there is a perception that this Galesburg stretch of I-94 is some kind of hotbed for problems, but we've heard several times now from MDOT that the statistics don't bear that out. What do you think about that?
Well, statistically, there are other places that may have per cars traveled might have a higher rate of accidents. But what we found is we have the highest number of accidents. This is a very heavily driven area. And we know that at right around mile marker 75, that's where the vast majority of all the places along I-94, that's where the largest amount happens. So while you might have different stretches along 94 that have a higher per vehicle traveled rate, we have the single largest number of car accidents. And a lot of it happens along eastern Kalamazoo County, western Calhoun County, and there's just something different there. And we know there's a number of issues that MDOT actually identifies. And, part of that is some areas you have concrete barriers or it doesn't allow a disabled vehicle to get off the road. Other places you've got the wire barrier, the cable barrier, that's right next to the road. And, again, it doesn't allow disabled cars to get out. And then there's been a lot of people who've talked about different weather phenomenon, and I've driven through it myself, where it seems like it's clear either side of that area, but in that area is bad. So there are a number of things that MDOT has said that they are looking to do.
Will they happen quick enough?
Quick enough, it'll never happen quick enough. But if we're honest with ourselves, redoing a road is, a 10-year process from design to securing money. Mm-hmm. So, and that's when it goes fast. But there are some things they're looking at, different environmental sensor stations to put in 2016 along that area so that you can have real-time data that drivers can see, and they can see if some spots up ahead are having weather impacts. And, that would be especially important for a day like today where we're getting varying reports on when the bulk of the storm's going to hit. It'd be helpful for drivers who aren't from Kalamazoo County, but they're heading through it to know maybe there's something different that's going to happen along this section of 94 than what they've previously been traveling.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we presume that would help MDOT be able to understand where the heaviest conditions are with those weather stations.
Absolutely. And, I don't know how many of your listeners use an app called Waze, W-A-Z-E. It's something I use a lot because it's real-time data, and it's what vehicles are entering in to their app right as it's happening. And so I always have that going on my car, and it'll speak out different things that I notice, whether it's an accident or slow traffic. And I know MDOT's working to try to figure out how they can have that real-time data so that, the weather stations, if we have weather stations along I-94, and they're also looking at it on 131, they're looking at it around the state, how you can have real-time weather stations that can then spit out the data back to drivers. And they are working to try to make sure that they can include apps that can be real-time data so that as drivers we know, hey, you know what? When I was driving through Detroit, coming through Jackson County, the weather was fine, but as I'm hitting Calhoun County, it's not so fine. But right now we don't know that until we hit it.
Right. That's true. It is interesting, though, because MDOT says the statistics don't bear out big problems in that stretch. The law enforcement officials with whom we've spoken as well say people just drive too fast for conditions. Do all of those things impact this situation, or is it one particular thing? I mean, after we saw that big mess there, we want something to blame and something to be able to fix. You know what I mean?
Well, it's multiple problems. When I've talked to different state police and local law enforcement, they all admit they're not going to sit on the side of the road on the I94 along there because it just isn't a good place for a car to sit because it causes other problems.
Right.
And so we already know the police don't patrol those areas. So when we say that the speed is too fast, well, if the police don't feel comfortable patrolling that area, then I question whether or not the roadway is fine. And that was cited in the report that, you know, some of the barriers being very close to the lane. I mean, think about driving through eastern Kalamazoo County. You start heading out from Sprinkle Road going east, and you've got that concrete barrier. And then they also noticed that some of the shoulders, there's a big decline into the ditch. And so what should feel like, hey, I can exit the roadway if I'm trying to avoid an accident or my car is disabled, you start feeling like there is no safe way to exit the roadway. And, you know, I've driven almost 32,000 miles this year.
Mm-hmm.
This is the single biggest problem I have of any part of the roads I've traveled, and I've gone all the way up to the UP. And this is always an issue. And, in fact, I had a constituent who left me a message just the other day and said, Margaret, I'm stuck here at this site again, right along the border. There have been multiple accidents, and the weather was fine. It was just raining a little. And they said, we got to do something. And so I think there's a lot of steps that can be taken. It will not be overnight, but slowly you're going to start seeing I-94 as we head east towards Battle Creek, towards 69, that we're going to see bridges being updated. We're going to see lanes being widened, but it's going to take a lot of time because doing roads is not cheap. And we also know that in the winter, this section of I-94 exceeds the average rate of accidents that other freeways have. And so we know that in the winter, this is a particularly tough time, especially eastbound, where there's more eastbound crashes than there are westbound. We know that this is a particularly tough stretch of the highway.
We're talking with Senator Margaret O'Brien of Kalamazoo, who said a little over a year ago we need to study this stretch of road where we saw that big 192-car pileup almost a year ago now. And we'll talk more about this coming up in just a minute after we take a break on WBCK. The question is there anything that can be done, I suppose, at this point to speed that up? And we'll discuss that in just a minute. And we're talking with Senator Margaret O'Brien from Kalamazoo on the line now. We've been discussing the notion that it was she who asked for a report of roadways after that year ago, nearly, problem along I-94, and the perception, at least, that this stretch along our county border is a difficult stretch along I-94. And one of the points you made, Senator, before the break was it takes time to do all of this. Is there anything Lansing can be doing now that might accelerate some of this?
Definitely. And, you know, one of the things that the report highlighted is the areas where there's a high incident of accidents, and it are primarily located on segments of I-94 where there's only 2 lanes. And so when you look at the number of places along the border that Kalamazoo and Calhoun County share, obviously that's all 2 lanes. So they've identified some things that they can do now. One of those is looking at possible cable barrier relocation, where the barrier is very close to the roadway, looking at where they could maybe put it in the center of the grassy median so it can allow for a vehicle to safely get itself off of the highway, especially if there's an accident they're trying to avoid. That was one of the issues that we had with the accident last January. There were people who could not safely exit the freeway because the barrier kept them from. So that's the first thing. The second is looking at putting in places where they can have crash investigation pull-off sites. So if there is a crash, you see this especially as you're going east in Michigan, you'll see these places. You're like, what's that? Well, that's where if the cars are able to, they want them to pull off. So if they're not blocking the freeway, especially when you have a thing where we've got the grass goes down on the shoulder and you can't really pull your car down there. The other thing is putting up all these environmental sensor stations, because you saw when you watched that video of the crash that there were people who all of a sudden were in a whiteout, and it's kind of difficult to know you should slow down until you get to that point. And so if you have environmental sensor stations that say no visibility, having signs prior to that letting people know, because one of the questions we had at the hearing was, great, you have a sign that says no visibility. What if you can't see the sign? You know, you got to have the notifications further down the road. And so making sure that we're able to give as much advance notice as possible. And then finally, having courtesy patrols. If there's particular stretches of the freeway where we know that drivers are probably going to be less likely to be able to be informed in advance, you actually, when you have a police car that's driving, people naturally start following behind it. And they've safely done that in other weather incidences, where that's another way to slow down the traffic, that the police car will go slower so everybody else goes slower. So those are some of the immediate things you can do. Long term, they're looking at making sure that they lengthen on and off ramps. They've noticed that's a problem along the border that we share. They're very short. Obviously, in order to expand the highway, we have a number of bridges we have to do. We've seen a number of them along our border have been redone, but there's still a number to do. And then also in areas of where we tend to have more slick roads, there are things that you can do to actually create what they call high friction surfaces. So it helps it keep the friction even when you've got ice on the road.
So a lot of these things that you've mentioned, we presume, will cost money, of course. Is this going to come out of the current MDOT budget? Do we have to earmark more funds for this, and are there stumbling blocks with that?
There are things that they're already planning to do now. The environmental sensor stations, a number of those were already in the plans and in the works to be done, but they've obviously become more of a priority, so that we already have some funds allocated towards there. Now, some of the things that we're going to have to allocate funds for is obviously anything that would be, increasing a higher friction surface. That's going to take more money. Obviously, making on and off ramps longer, that's money. So I'm working with MDOT on what's the long-term plan. Now that we got the report, how do we plan for these things in the long term? And I think the good news for the people in Kalamazoo and Calhoun counties is we've already been seeing the creep going from the west over to the east of the bridges being redone. So then you see the third lane being added. And interestingly enough, when you have that extra lane, when there are accidents, which there's a high number of accidents at the I-94 131 intersection, people don't notice it because there's plenty of room for disabled vehicles to get safely off the road. So as we can increase to a third lane, if there are still a high number of accidents, it's going to be less likely to be multi-car, because Kalamazoo and Van Buren County have more multi-vehicle big crashes than anywhere else in the state. And I think that's because you can't safely get the vehicles off the road.
We saw what kind of challenge it was to come up with a road funding deal in Lansing over the last several months. Is it possible that this kind of stuff, which you can see clearly on your list need to be done, would get caught up in a similar situation and thus delayed?
Money is always an issue. It does not get cheaper to do roads, and as technology improves, the cost tends to increase as well. I think it's going to get done, but again, it's going to be long term. And we also need to understand there's no easy answers to funding roads. And so when people say, well, you can do a 100% cut, you can do 100% increasing taxes, at the end of the day, to make sure that we have the right amount of road funding, it takes 50, well, it will once the House is up to 110 representatives. It takes 56 votes in the House, 20 votes in the Senate, and the governor to agree. So it's all about finding a compromise and a sweet spot. But now that we've got this passed, I'm working with MDOT and going, what is the long-term plans? And the good news is MDOT's already been focused on incrementally working their way eastward on this highway. And so the question is there any opportunity to speed up and to make it happen sooner than later? And that's the big question that I need to work with them on, because obviously we don't want to increase road safety at somebody else's expense where their roads stay unsafe. So it's working with them on how is the allocation of the new funds going to come into play, and how do they look at allocating it.
So do you have a deadline for the next step?
You know, it's ongoing conversation with them right now. We've got a budget that we're just starting working on that will be introduced by the governor in February. So working with them right now on what they see as both short and long term. We've had great conversations, and they've not been afraid to tackle hard questions that don't seem to have an easy answer. So I'm optimistic you're going to continue to see the incremental approach. And in fact, eastbound Kalamazoo County has some projects planned starting at Portage Road. We're going to start seeing a lot of these projects done. And then you've got the Climax exit, which will have a project done. So in the next couple years, we've got some big projects that will allow the creek to continue towards Calhoun County. So I feel pretty good about it.
All right. Well, we appreciate the time you've given us today, Senator Margaret O'Brien of Kalamazoo. Thank you very much.